Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we begin tonight's reading, I'd like to thank Marie for becoming the latest member of our Patreon family. Marie, thank you so much for your support. It makes this podcast possible, and it's much appreciated. I recently announced some updates to the Patreon, including new rewards available now and more that will be coming this month. If you'd like to check that out, just go to www.patreon.com/boringbookspod or follow the link in the show description. Now, let's get to the reading. Tonight, we're continuing our series of returns to some of your favorites with A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells, published by the Macmillan and Company, New York, 1922. Let's pick up where we left off. Chapter 12, Primitive Thought. And now let us indulge in a very interesting speculation. How did it feel to be a man in those early days of the human adventure? How did men think, and what did they think, in those remote days of hunting and wandering 400 centuries ago, before seed time and harvest began? Those were days long before the written record of any human impressions, and we are left almost entirely to inference and guesswork in our answers to these questions. The sources to which scientific men have gone in their attempts to reconstruct that primitive mentality are very various. Recently, the science of psychoanalysis, which analyzes the way in which the egotistic and passionate impulses of the child are restrained, suppressed, modified, or overlaid to adapt them to the needs of social life, seems to have thrown a considerable amount of light upon the history of primitive society. And another fruitful source of suggestion has been the study of the ideas and customs of such contemporary people as still survive. Again, there is a sort of mental fossilization which we find in folklore and the deep-lying irrational superstitions and prejudices that still survive among modern civilized people. And finally, we have in the increasingly numerous pictures, statues, carvings, symbols, and the like, as we draw near to our own time, clearer and clearer indications of what man found interesting and worthy of record and representation. Primitive man probably thought very much as a child thinks. That is to say, in a series of imaginative pictures. He conjured up images, or images presented themselves to his mind, and he acted in accordance with the emotions they aroused. So a child or an uneducated person does today. Systematic thinking is apparently a comparatively late development in human experience. It has not played any great part in human life until within the last 3,000 years. And even today, those who really control and order their thoughts are but a small minority of mankind. Most of the world still lives by imagination and passion. Probably the earliest human societies, in the opening stages of the true human story, were small family groups. Just as the flocks and herds of the earlier mammals arose out of families which remained together and multiplied, so probably did the earliest tribes. But before this could happen, a certain restraint upon the primitive egotisms of the individual had to be established. The fear of the father and respect for the mother had to be extended into adult life, and the natural jealousy of the old man of the group for the younger males as they grew up had to be mitigated. The mother, on the other hand, was the natural adviser and protector of the young. Human social life grew up out of the reaction between the crude instinct of the young to go off and pair by themselves as they grew up, and the dangers and disadvantages of separation. An anthropological writer of great genius, J. Atkinson, in his Primal Law, has shown how much of the customary law of savages, the taboos that are so remarkable a fact in tribal life, can be ascribed to such a mental adjustment of the needs of the primitive human animal to a developing social life. And the later work of the psychoanalysts has done much to confirm his interpretation of these possibilities. Some speculative writers would have us believe that respect and fear of the old man and the emotional reaction of the primitive savage to older protective women, exaggerated in dreams and enriched by fanciful mental play, played a large part in the beginnings of primitive religion and in the conception of gods and goddesses. Associated with this respect for powerful or helpful personalities was a dread and exaltation of such personages after their deaths, due to their reappearance in dreams. It was easy to believe they were not truly dead, but only fantastically transferred to a remoteness of greater power. The dreams, imaginations, and fears of a child are far more vivid and real than those of a modern adult, and primitive man was always something of a child. He was nearer to the animals also, and he could suppose them to have motives and reactions like his own. He could imagine animal helpers, animal enemies, animal gods. One needs to have been an imaginative child oneself to realize again how important, significant, portentous or friendly, strangely shaped rocks, lumps of wood, exceptional trees or the like may have appeared to the men of the old Stone Age, and how dream and fancy would create stories and legends about such things that would become credible as they told them. Some of these stories would be good enough to remember and tell again. The women would tell them to the children, and so establish a tradition. To this day, most imaginative children invent long stories in which some favorite doll or animal, or some fantastic semi-human being figures as the hero, and primitive man probably did the same, with a much stronger disposition to believe his hero real. For the very earliest of the true men that we know of were probably quite talkative beings. In that way they have differed from the Neanderthalers and had an advantage over them. The Neanderthaler may have been a dumb animal. Of course, the primitive human speech was probably a very scanty collection of names, and may have been eked out with gestures and signs. There is no sort of savage so low as not to have a kind of science of cause and effect, but primitive man was not very critical in his associations of cause with effect. He very easily connected an effect with something quite wrong as its cause. You do so and so, he said, and so happens. You give a child a poisonous berry, and it dies. You eat the heart of a valiant enemy, and you become strong. There we have two bits of cause and effect association, one true, one false. We call the system of cause and effect in the mind of a savage fetish, but fetish is simply savage science. It differs from modern science in that it is totally unsystematic and uncritical, and so more frequently wrong. In many cases, it is not difficult to link cause and effect. In many others, erroneous ideas were soon corrected by experience. But there was a large series of issues of very great importance to primitive man, where he sought persistently for causes and found explanations that were wrong but not sufficiently wrong, nor so obviously wrong as to be detected. It was a matter of great importance to him that game should be abundant, or fish plentiful and easily caught, and no doubt he tried and believed in 1,000 charms, incantations, and omens to determine these desirable results. Another great concern of his was illness and death. Occasionally infections crept through the land, and men died of them. Occasionally men were stricken by illness and died, or were enfeebled without any manifest cause. This too must have given the hasty, emotional mind of primitive man much feverish exercise. Dreams and fantastic guesses made him blame this or appeal for help to that man or beast or thing. He had the child's aptitude for fear and panic. Quite early in the little human tribe, older, steadier minds, sharing the fears, sharing the imaginations, but a little more forceful than the others, must have asserted themselves to advise, to prescribe, to command. This they declared unpropitious, and that imperative, this an omen of good, and that an omen of evil. The expert in fetish, the medicine man, was the first priest. He exhorted, he interpreted dreams, he warned, he performed the complicated hocus-pocus that brought luck or averted calamity. Primitive religion was not so much what we now call religion as practice and observance, and the early priest dictated what was indeed an arbitrary, primitive, practical science. Chapter 13. The Beginnings of Cultivation. We are still very ignorant about the beginnings of cultivation and settlement in the world, although a vast amount of research and speculation has been given to these matters in the last 50 years. All that we can say with any confidence at present is that somewhen between 15,000 and 12,000 BC, while the Azilian people were in the south of Spain, and while the remnants of the earlier hunters were drifting northward and eastward, somewhere in North Africa or Western Asia, or in that great Mediterranean valley that is now submerged under the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, there were people who, age by age, were working out two vitally important things. They were beginning cultivation, and they were domesticating animals. They were also beginning to make, in addition to the chipped implements of their hunter forebears, implements of polished stone. They had discovered the possibility of basket work and roughly woven textiles of plant fiber, and they were beginning to make a rudely modeled pottery. They were entering upon a new phase in human culture, the Neolithic phase or New Stone Age, as distinguished from the Paleolithic or Old Stone phase of the Cro-Magnards, the Grimaldi people, the Azilians, and their like. Slowly, these Neolithic people spread over the warmer parts of the world, and the arts they had mastered, the plants and animals they had learnt to use, spread by imitation and acquisition even more widely than they did. By 10,000 BC, most of mankind was at the Neolithic level. Now the plowing of land, the sowing of seed, the reaping of harvest, threshing and grinding may seem the most obviously reasonable steps to a modern mind, just as to a modern mind it is a commonplace that the world is round. What else could you do? People will ask. What else can it be? But to the primitive man of 20,000 years ago, neither of the systems of action and reasoning that seem so sure and manifest to us today were at all obvious. He felt his way to effectual practice through a multitude of trials and misconceptions, with fantastic and unnecessary elaborations and false interpretations at every turn. Somewhere in the Mediterranean region, wheat grew wild, and man may have learned to pound and then grind up its seeds for food long before he learned to sow. He reaped before he sowed. And it is a very remarkable thing that throughout the world, wherever there is sowing and harvesting, there is still traceable the vestiges of a strong primitive association of the idea of sowing with the idea of a blood sacrifice, and primarily of the sacrifice of a human being. The study of the original entanglement of these two things is a profoundly attractive one to the curious mind. The interested reader will find it very fully developed in that monumental work, Sir J. G. Fraser's Golden Bough. It was an entanglement, we must remember, in the childish, dreaming, myth-making primitive mind. No reasoned process will explain it. But in that world of 12,000 to 20,000 years ago, it would seem that whenever seed time came round to the Neolithic peoples, there was a human sacrifice. And it was not the sacrifice of any mean or outcast person. It was the sacrifice usually of a chosen youth or maiden, a youth more often who was treated with profound deference and even worship up to the moment of his immolation. He was a sort of sacrificial god-king, and all the details of his killing had become a ritual directed by the old, knowing men and sanctioned by the accumulated usage of ages. At first, primitive men, with only a very rough idea of the seasons, must have found great difficulty in determining when was the propitious moment for the seed-time sacrifice and the sowing. There is some reason for supposing that there was an early stage in human experience when men had no idea of a year. The first chronology was in lunar months. It is supposed that the years of the biblical patriarchs are really moons, and the Babylonian calendar shows distinct traces of an attempt to reckon seed time by taking 13 lunar months to see it round. This lunar influence upon the calendar reaches down to our own days. If usage did not dull our sense of its strangeness, we should think it a very remarkable thing indeed that the Christian Church does not commemorate the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ on the proper anniversaries, but on dates that vary year by year with the phases of the moon. It may be doubted whether the first agriculturalists made any observation of the stars. It is more likely that stars were first observed by migratory herdsmen who found them a convenient mark of direction. But once their use in determining seasons was realized, their importance to agriculture became very great. The seed-time sacrifice was linked up with the southing or northing of some prominent star. A myth and worship of that star was for primitive man an almost inevitable consequence. It is easy to see how important the man of knowledge and experience, the man who knew about the blood sacrifice and the stars, became in this early Neolithic world. The fear of uncleanness and pollution, and the methods of cleansing that were advisable, constituted another source of power for the knowledgeable men and women, for there have always been witches as well as wizards, and priestesses as well as priests. The early priest was really not so much a religious man as a man of applied science. His science was generally empirical and often bad. He kept it secret from the generality of men very jealously. But that does not alter the fact that his primary function was knowledge, and that his primary use was a practical use. 12 or 15,000 years ago, in all the warm and fairly well-watered parts of the Old World, these Neolithic human communities, with their class and tradition of priests and priestesses, and their cultivated fields and their development of villages and little walled cities were spreading. Age by age, a drift and exchange of ideas went on between these communities. Elliott Smith and Rivers have used the term Heliolithic culture for the culture of these first agricultural peoples. Heliolithic, or sun and stone, is not perhaps the best possible word to use for this, but until scientific men give us a better one, we shall have to use it. Originating somewhere in the Mediterranean and Western Asiatic area, it spread age by age eastward and from island to island across the Pacific, until it may even have reached America and mingled with the more primitive ways of living of the immigrants coming down from the north. Wherever the brownish people with the Heliolithic culture went, they took with them all or most of a certain group of curious ideas and practices. Some of them are such queer ideas that they call for the explanation of the mental expert. They made pyramids and great mounds, and set up great circles of big stones, perhaps to facilitate the astronomical observation of the priests. They made mummies of some or all of their dead. They tattooed and circumcised. They had the old custom, known as the couvade, of sending the father to bed and rest when a child was born, and they had as a luck symbol the same design. If we were to make a map of the world with dots to show how far these group practices have left their traces, we should make a belt along the temperate and subtropical coasts of the world, from Stonehenge and Spain, across the world to Mexico and Peru. But Africa below the equator, North Central Europe, and North Asia would show none of these dottings. There lived races who were developing along practically independent lines. Chapter 14: Primitive Neolithic Civilizations. About 10,000 BC, the geography of the world was very similar in its general outline to that of the world today. It is probable that by that time, the great barrier across the Straits of Gibraltar that had hitherto banked back the ocean waters from the Mediterranean valley had been eaten through, and that the Mediterranean was a sea, following much the same coastlines as it now does. The Caspian Sea was probably still far more extensive than it is at present, and it may have been continuous with the Black Sea to the north of the Caucasus Mountains. About this great Central Asian Sea, lands that are now steppes and deserts were fertile and habitable. Generally, it was a moister and more fertile world. European Russia was much more a land of swamp and lake than it is now, and there may still have been a land connection between Asia and America at Bering Straits. It would have been already possible at that time to have distinguished the main racial divisions of mankind as we know them today. Across the warm temperate regions of this rather warmer and better wooded world, and along the coasts, stretched the brownish peoples of the Heliolithic culture, the ancestors of the bulk of the living inhabitants of the Mediterranean world, of the Berbers, the Egyptians, and of much of the population of South and Eastern Asia. This great race had, of course, a number of varieties. The Iberian or Mediterranean, or dark white race of the Atlantic and Mediterranean coast. The Hamitic peoples, which included the Berbers and Egyptians. The Dravidians, the darker people of India, a multitude of East Indian people, many Polynesian races, and the Maori are all divisions of various value of this great main mass of humanity. In the forests of Central and Northern Europe, a more blonde variety of men with blue eyes was becoming distinguishable, branching off from the main mass of brownish people, a variety which many people now speak of as the Nordic race. In the more open regions of northeastern Asia was another differentiation of this brownish humanity, in the direction of a type with more oblique eyes, high cheekbones, a yellowish skin, and very straight black hair, the Mongolian peoples. In South Africa, Australia, in many tropical islands in the south of Asia, were remains of the early Negroid peoples. The central parts of Africa were already a region of racial intermixture. Nearly all the races of Africa today seem to be blends of the brownish peoples of the north with a Negroid substratum. We have to remember that human races can all interbreed freely, and that they separate, mingle, and reunite as clouds do. Human races do not branch out like trees, with branches that never come together again. It is a thing we need to bear constantly in mind, this remingling of races at any opportunity. It will save us from many cruel delusions and prejudices if we do so. People will use such a word as race in the loosest manner, and base the most preposterous generalizations upon it. They will speak of a British race or of a European race, but nearly all the European nations are confused mixtures of brownish, white, and Mongolian elements. It was at the Neolithic phase of human development that peoples of the Mongolian breed first made their way into America. Apparently, they came by way of Bering Straits and spread southward. They found caribou, the American reindeer, in the north, and great herds of bison in the south. When they reached South America, there were still living the Glyptodon, a gigantic armadillo, and the Megatherium, a monstrous, clumsy sloth as high as an elephant. They probably exterminated the latter beast, which was as helpless as it was big. The greater portion of these American tribes never rose above a hunting nomadic Neolithic life. They never discovered the use of iron, and their chief metal possessions were native gold and copper. But in Mexico, Yucatan, and Peru, conditions existed favorable to settled cultivation. And here, about 1000 BC or so, arose very interesting civilizations of a parallel but different type from the Old World civilization. Like the much earlier primitive civilizations of the Old World, these communities displayed a great development of human sacrifice about the processes of seed time and harvest. But while in the Old World, as we shall see, these primary ideas were ultimately mitigated, complicated, and overlaid by others, in America they developed and were elaborated to a very high degree of intensity. These American civilized countries were essentially priest-ruled countries. Their war chiefs and rulers were under a rigorous rule of law and omen. These priests carried astronomical science to a high level of accuracy. They knew their year better than the Babylonians, of whom we shall presently tell. In Yucatan they had a kind of writing, the Maya writing, of the most curious and elaborate character. So far as we have been able to decipher it, it was used mainly for keeping the exact and complicated calendars upon which the priests expended their intelligence. The art of the Maya civilization came to a climax about 700 or 800 AD. The sculptured work of these people amazes the modern observer by its great plastic power and its frequent beauty, and perplexes him by a grotesqueness and by a sort of insane conventionality and intricacy outside the circle of his ideas. There is nothing quite like it in the Old World. The nearest approach, and that is a remote one, is found in archaic Indian carvings. Everywhere there are woven feathers, and serpents twine in and out. It is as if the Maya mind had developed upon a different mind from the Old World mind, had a different twist to his ideas, was not, by Old World standards, a rational mind at all. This linking of these aberrant American civilizations to the idea of a general mental aberration finds support in their extraordinary obsession by the shedding of human blood. The Mexican civilization in particular ran with blood. It offered thousands of human victims yearly. The cutting open of living victims, the tearing out of the still beating heart, was an act that dominated the minds and lives of these strange priesthoods. The public life, the national festivities, all turned on this fantastically horrible act. The ordinary existence of the common people in these communities was very like the ordinary existence of any other barbaric peasantry. Their pottery, weaving, and dyeing was very good. The Maya writing was not only carven on stone, but written and painted upon skins and the like. The European and American museums contain many enigmatical Maya manuscripts, of which at present little has been deciphered except the dates. In Peru, there were beginnings of a similar writing, but they were superseded by a method of keeping records by knotting cords. A similar method of mnemonics was in use in China thousands of years ago. In the Old World, before 4000 or 5000 BC, that is to say 3,000 or 4,000 years earlier, there were primitive civilizations not unlike these American civilizations. Civilizations based upon a temple, having a vast quantity of blood sacrifices, and with an intensely astronomical priesthood. But in the Old World, the primitive civilizations reacted upon one another and developed towards the conditions of our own world. In America, these primitive civilizations never progressed beyond this primitive stage. Each of them was in a little world of its own. Mexico, it seems, knew little or nothing of Peru until the Europeans came to America. The potato, which was the principal foodstuff in Peru, was unknown in Mexico. Age by age, these peoples lived and marveled at their gods, and made their sacrifices and died. Maya art rose to high levels of decorative beauty. Men made love and tribes made war. Drought and plenty, pestilence and health followed one another. The priests elaborated their calendar and their sacrificial ritual through long centuries, but made little progress in other directions. Chapter 15. Sumeria, Early Egypt, and Writing. The Old World is a wider, more varied stage than the New. By 6000 or 7000 BC, there were already quasi-civilized communities almost at the Peruvian level, appearing in various fertile regions of Asia and in the Nile Valley. At that time, North Persia and Western Turkestan and South Arabia were all more fertile than they are now, and there are traces of very early communities in these regions. It is in Lower Mesopotamia, however, and in Egypt, that there first appear cities, temples, systematic irrigation, and evidences of a social organization rising above the level of a mere barbaric village. In those days, the Euphrates and Tigris flowed by separate mouths into the Persian Gulf, and it was in the country between them that the Sumerians built their first cities. About the same time, for chronology is still vague, the great history of Egypt was beginning. These Sumerians employed a sort of writing that has been deciphered, and their language is now known. They had discovered the use of bronze, and they built great tower-like temples of sun-dried brick. The clay of this country is very fine. They used it to write upon, and so it is that their inscriptions have been preserved to us. They had cattle, sheep, goats, and asses, but no horses. They fought on foot in close formation, carrying spears and shields of skin. Their clothing was of wool, and they shaved their heads. Each of the Sumerian cities seems generally to have been an independent state, with a god of its own and priests of its own. But sometimes one city would establish an ascendancy over others and exact tribute from their population. A very ancient inscription at Nippur records the empire, the first recorded empire, of the Sumerian city of Erech. Its god and its priest king claimed an authority from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. At first, writing was merely an abbreviated method of pictorial record. Even before Neolithic times, men were beginning to write. The Azelian rock pictures, to which we have already referred, show the beginning of the process. Many of them record hunts and expeditions, and in most of these, the human figures are plainly drawn. But in some, the painter would not bother with head and limbs. He just indicated men by a vertical or one or two transverse strokes. From this to a conventional condensed picture writing was an easy transition. In Sumeria, where the writing was done on clay with a stick, the dabs of the characters soon became unrecognizably unlike the things they stood for. But in Egypt, where men painted on walls or on strips of the papyrus reed, the first paper, the likeness to the thing imitated remained. From the fact that the wooden styluses used in Sumeria made wedge-shaped marks, the Sumerian writing is called cuneiform, or wedge-shaped. An important step towards writing was made when pictures were used to indicate not the thing represented, but some similar thing. In the rebus dear to children of a suitable age, this is still done today. We draw a camp with tents and a bell, and the child is delighted to guess that this is the Scotch name, Campbell. The Sumerian language was a language made up of accumulated syllables, rather like some contemporary Amerindian languages, and it lent itself very readily to this syllabic method of writing words, expressing ideas that could not be conveyed by pictures directly. Egyptian writing underwent parallel developments. Later on, when foreign peoples with less distinctly syllabled methods of speech were to learn and use these picture scripts, they were to make those further modifications and simplifications that developed at last into alphabetical writing. All the true alphabets of the later world derived from a mixture of the Sumerian cuneiform and the Egyptian hieroglyphic priest writing. Later in China, there was to develop a conventionalized picture writing, but in China, it never got to the alphabetical stage. The invention of writing was of very great importance in the development of human societies. It put agreements, laws, commandments on record. It made the growth of states larger than the old city-states possible. It made a continuous historical consciousness possible. The command of the priest or king and his seal could go far beyond his sight and voice, and could survive his death. It is interesting to note that in ancient Sumeria, seals were greatly used. A king or a nobleman or a merchant would have his seal often very artistically carved, and would impress it on any clay document he wished to authorize. So close had civilization got to printing 6,000 years ago. Then the clay was dried hard and became permanent. For the reader must remember that in the land of Mesopotamia, for countless years, letters, records, and accounts were all written on comparatively indestructible tiles. To that fact, we owe a great wealth of recovered knowledge. Bronze, copper, gold, silver, and as a precious rarity, meteoric iron were known in both Sumeria and Egypt at a very early stage. Daily life in those first city lands of the Old World must have been very similar in both Egypt and Sumeria, and except for the asses and cattle in the streets, it must have been not unlike the life in the Maya cities of America 3,000 or 4,000 years later. Most of the people in peacetime were busy with irrigation and cultivation, except on days of religious festivity. They had no money and no need for it. They managed their occasional small trades by barter. The princes and rulers who alone had more than a few possessions used gold and silver bars and precious stones for any incidental act of trade. The temple dominated life. In Sumeria, it was a great towering temple that went up to a roof from which the stars were observed. In Egypt, it was a massive building with only a ground floor. In Sumeria, the priest-ruler was the greatest, most splendid of beings. In Egypt, however, there was one who was raised above the priests. He was the living incarnation of the chief god of the land, the Pharaoh, the god-king. There were few changes in the world in those days. Men's days were sunny, toilsome, and conventional. Few strangers came into the land, and such as did fared uncomfortably. The priest directed life according to immemorial rules, and watched the stars for seed time, and marked the omens of the sacrifices, and interpreted the warnings of dreams. Men worked and loved and died, not unhappily, forgetful of the savage past of their race and heedless of its future. Sometimes the ruler was benign. Such was Pepi II, who reigned in Egypt for 90 years. Sometimes he was ambitious and took men's sons to be soldiers and sent them against neighboring city-states to war and plunder, or he made them toil to build great buildings. Such were Cheops and Khephren and Mycerinus, who built those vast sepulchral piles, the pyramids at Giza. The largest of these is 450 feet high, and the weight of stone in it is 4,883,000 tons. All this was brought down the Nile in boats and lugged into place chiefly by human muscle. Its erection must have exhausted Egypt more than any great war would have done. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from A Short History of the World by H.G. Wells. Admittedly, anthropology, archaeology, and biology have come a ways since 1922, but I find it interesting just how much he got right. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, you'll find a link to a free ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, catch me on Twitter at BoringBooksPod or send me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. podcast@boringbookspod.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.